Stephen Grant sat at the head of the dinner table, his sharp suit a perfect match for the polished image he had spent years building. His wife, Tara, sat beside him, a warm smile on her face, though her eyes seemed distant, focused on something only she could see. The children, their two young kids, laughed and joked as they passed the potatoes around, and for a moment, everything felt right. Everything felt perfect. The house was a reflection of the family's life, immaculate, with every corner of their home designed to embody success. The kitchen gleamed, and the pictures on the walls spoke of a story that everyone in Washington Township seemed to admire. Stephen, the businessman who had it all. Tara, the picture of grace and beauty, and their beautiful children who were the image of happiness. But even in moments like this, when everything appeared as it should, there were cracks. Small, imperceptible ones, but cracks all the same. Stephen didn't notice it at first, the subtle distance growing between him and Tara. His focus was always on his business. After all, that was what made them who they were. But there was something about the way Tara would avoid his gaze when he spoke to her. The way her smile seemed less genuine. It was almost like she was hiding something. But Stephen pushed the thought aside. After all, Tara had always been there, supportive, the perfect wife. What could possibly go wrong? Tara, on the other hand, felt like she was suffocating. She loved Stephen, or at least she thought she did, but their marriage had become a cage. For years she had supported him, admired him, loved him. But now she felt invisible in her own home. His work took precedence over everything else, his career, his clients, his ambition. There was no room for her. She longed for something more than the quiet dinners and the perfect family image. She began to retreat, withdrawing into herself. Her phone became a lifeline, a connection to a world outside of her suffocating marriage. It was through this screen that she met James Martin, a colleague from her job. What started as friendly exchanges quickly grew into something more. James was attentive, kind, and he saw her. For the first time in a long while, Tara felt like she mattered. But even as she sought solace in this new connection, a sense of guilt gnawed at her. She wasn't sure what she was doing, but she knew she couldn't go on living the way she had been. She was trapped. The walls of her perfect life had started to close in on her, and she didn't know how to escape. Stephen, wrapped up in his world of deadlines and meetings, was oblivious to the growing distance. He saw the late nights, the quiet dinners, but he didn't see the changes in her heart. He didn't notice the way her eyes would sometimes drift away when they were together, or the way her fingers would nervously tap the table during conversations. He didn't see that Tara was no longer the woman he had married. As the days passed, the cracks widened. Tara's phone became more of a secret, hidden beneath pillows or in the bottom drawer of her nightstand. The messages between her and James were brief, but they were enough to make her feel something she hadn't felt in years. Alive. Stephen, though, remained in the dark, his mind consumed by his work. He trusted Tara implicitly, believing that their perfect family would remain just that, perfect. But sometimes perfection is just an illusion. Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with small, almost insignificant details. Tara's late nights had become more frequent. She would disappear into the other room, phone pressed tightly to her ear, whispering softly. When Stephen would ask about it, she would shrug, offering some excuse about work or a friend. But the unease gnawed at him, and the more he thought about it, the more questions piled up in his mind. The change in her was subtle at first. It wasn't as though she was openly distant, but the warmth that once filled their home seemed to fade. Tara no longer seemed as interested in the small moments, the laughter-filled dinners, the quiet mornings with coffee. The playful banter they once shared had dulled, replaced by an unspoken tension. Stephen could feel it, even if he couldn't name it. It wasn't just the phone calls. It was the way Tara would avoid his gaze, the way she'd turn quickly when he walked into the room. Her smile, once genuine and effortless, now seemed strained. He started paying closer attention, noticing the little things, the way her shoulders tensed when he asked a question or how her voice seemed to falter in conversation. One night, as he sat in his home office, Stephen overheard Tara on the phone again. She was speaking softly, her voice barely audible. but there was something about her tone that sent a chill through him. It wasn't the casual tone she used when talking about their children or mundane topics. It was something different, something secretive. He strained his ears to hear the words, but she ended the call quickly, almost too quickly. The seed of suspicion had been planted, but Stephen still didn't want to believe it. He trusted Tara. They had built a life together, a family, and he couldn't fathom the idea of betrayal. But the doubts lingered like a shadow, just out of reach but always present. He found himself watching her more closely, analyzing every glance, every word. Then came the incident that set everything in motion. One evening, Stephen returned home earlier than usual. Tara was on the couch, phone in hand, laughing at something she was reading. The moment she saw him, the laughter stopped, and she quickly stuffed the phone into her purse. Stephen's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time he had caught her in a moment of secrecy, but this felt different. There was a hesitation, an unease that wasn't there before. "Who was that?" Stephen asked, trying to keep his voice casual, though the tension was palpable. "Oh, just a work thing," Tara replied, flashing a tight smile, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze shifted nervously, and Stephen couldn't help but notice the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. The unease in his chest tightened, and for the first time, Stephen wondered if his suspicions were more than just paranoia. The thought that Tara might be hiding something, that she might be cheating, filled him with a mix of rage and disbelief. He wanted to confront her, demand answers, but something inside him held him back. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, his mind racing with questions he didn't want to ask and answers he didn't want to hear. Days passed, but the feeling only intensified. Stephen found himself unable to focus on anything else. He checked his phone less, his business meetings became background noise, and his mind was consumed with Tara. Was it just a phase, or was there something more? He couldn't tell. But when Tara disappeared for another late night, this time with no explanation, Stephen's resolve began to crack. The fear, the doubt, and the overwhelming need to know the truth drove him to make a decision. He would find out once and for all. He didn't know how, but he couldn't live with this gnawing suspicion any longer. Nail in the coffin. He began to think about the private investigator, a friend of a friend. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but his gut told him it was the only way to uncover the truth. Stephen sat at his desk, staring blankly at the papers in front of him. His mind was a whirlwind, consumed by thoughts of Tara and her increasingly suspicious behavior. The private investigator had been following her for a week now, but Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that he needed more. He needed concrete proof, something undeniable. His heart pounded as he glanced at the clock. It was late, almost midnight. Tara had left earlier that evening, claiming to meet a friend for dinner. He couldn't help but feel that it was just another lie. He had been overthinking it, but the gut-wrenching feeling gnawed at him. Unable to wait any longer, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He had to know. He had to confront her with the truth, or at least what he suspected to be the truth. His feet moved almost instinctively as he walked down the hallway toward their bedroom. Tara's purse sat carelessly on the nightstand, and her phone was inside. Without hesitation, Stephen grabbed the phone, his fingers trembling. He knew it was a breach of trust, but right now, trust felt like a fragile illusion. The phone's screen lit up as Stephen unlocked it. The first thing he saw was a series of messages, all from James Martin. They were intimate, flirtatious, and filled with an unsettling familiarity. Stephen's stomach dropped. His worst fears were realized. Tara and James were having an affair. The first message made Stephen's blood run cold. "I miss you already. Can't wait to see you tonight." It was signed off with a smiley face, the kind of message that, in any other context, would have seemed harmless. But to Stephen, it was a dagger. A brutal reminder that the woman he loved had been betraying him. He scrolled through more messages, late-night exchanges, secret rendezvous, and whispers of promises of a life together. Tara had been seeing James for months, all while pretending everything was normal at home. "When do you think you'll be ready to leave him?" one message read, followed by another. "I'll wait for you. We can start fresh, just the two of us." Stephen felt the floor shift beneath him. His whole world had tilted. His stomach churned as he realized how deep Tara's betrayal went. The text messages were clear. She was planning to leave him. She had already begun the process of divorcing him and building a future with James. It felt like his heart had been ripped out of his chest. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend the weight of the truth. How could she do this to him, to their family, to their children? But as Stephen continued to read, something caught his eye. One of the messages was different from the others. It wasn't from James, but from an unknown number. It was brief, just a few words, but it stopped him cold. "It's time. Do it now before it's too late." His pulse quickened. The message felt like a threat, a final push for Tara to act. But what did it mean? Who had sent it? And what did "do it now" refer to? The urgency in the message unsettled him even more. Stephen's mind was racing, every thought colliding with the next. He couldn't ignore this. The pieces were falling into place and he had to confront Tara. But what would happen when he did? He couldn't wait any longer. His hands shook as he placed the phone back on the nightstand and walked toward the living room, his mind filled with questions and fury. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the confrontation, but there was no turning back now. The evidence was undeniable. Tara had been lying to him, hiding her affair and preparing to leave him. And now Stephen had a choice to make. How would he handle the truth? How would he confront the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, when he knew everything? The night was thick with tension, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Stephen stood by the front door, his hands clutched tightly at his sides. The house felt colder than usual, the silence more oppressive. He had waited long enough. He had confronted the truth in those text messages, those words that had destroyed the illusion of his perfect life. But now the time had come to face Tara. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reminding him of the anger, the hurt, and the confusion that had built up inside him. He knew this confrontation would change everything. He didn't know how or what would happen next, but he couldn't keep living with this gnawing emptiness. He had to know. He had to hear it from her own lips. The sound of the door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Tara stepped inside, her eyes bright with the fatigue of the long day, but she froze when she saw him standing there waiting. Her gaze flickered to the phone in his hand, and in that moment Stephen could see the fear creeping into her eyes. She knew. "Tara," Stephen said, his voice cold, controlled, yet trembling with emotion. "We need to talk." Tara hesitated, her lips pressing together in a thin line. She knew what was coming, and it was evident in the way she shifted uneasily on her feet. "What about?" she asked, her tone a mix of caution and defiance. Stephen held up the phone, the one that had exposed everything. His eyes never left hers as he scrolled through the incriminating messages, each word, each line cutting deeper into his soul. He stopped at the one that had haunted him most, the message that she and James had exchanged about their future plans together. Tara's face went pale, her breath catching as she realized what he had discovered. The walls she had carefully built around her lies were crumbling, and there was nowhere left to hide. You went through my phone?" Her voice was defensive, a slight tremor betraying the facade she was trying so desperately to maintain. "I had to know, Tara," Stephen replied, his voice raw with emotion. "I had to know if everything we had was just a lie." Tara took a step back, her arms instinctively folding across her chest. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice faltering. "I never meant for it to get this far. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Stephen's eyes burned with hurt. "How long, Tara? How long have you been planning this? How long have you been seeing him?" His voice broke slightly on the last word, and the anger that had been simmering for days threatened to break free. Tara looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Her silence spoke louder than any words could. It was the confirmation Stephen needed. The betrayal was complete. "I'm sorry," she said finally, though the words felt hollow. She shook her head as if trying to find the right way to explain. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened. You've been so focused on your career, Stephen. I felt alone. And James, he made me feel like I mattered." The words were like a slap, each one sending a fresh wave of fury crashing over Stephen. His jaw clenched as he fought to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Tara, his wife, the mother of his children, had chosen another man. He wasn't just angry, he was broken. "How long?" he repeated, his voice cracking this time. "How long have you been planning to leave me, Tara? How long have you been lying to me, to our family?" Tara's gaze dropped, her face etched with guilt, but there was no apology in her eyes. There was no true remorse. There was only the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. I've been thinking about it for a while," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep pretending anymore." The finality of her words hit Stephen like a freight train. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, was leaving him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A mix of emotions flooded him: anger, pain, betrayal, but most of all an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it was no use. The walls he had so carefully built around his emotions were crumbling. He was on the edge, and all he could feel was the raging storm inside him. "Do you even care about us?" Stephen asked, his voice shaking with the weight of the question. "Do you care about this family?" Tara stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. "Of course I do," she said, her voice breaking. "But I've been dying inside, Stephen. You never saw me. You never saw how much I needed you, and James. He gave me the attention I've been craving. I felt alive again." Stephen took a step back, his body trembling with the force of his emotions. The weight of her betrayal was unbearable. He wanted to scream, to make her feel the same pain he was feeling, but he couldn't. The truth was, there was nothing he could do to fix this. "I never wanted this," Tara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "But I can't keep living a lie. I'm sorry." Stephen stood there, motionless, his heart breaking in silence. The woman he had trusted more than anyone else had just shattered his world. The reality of it all hit him harder than any blow could. There was no turning back from this moment. Tara had already made her choice, and in that instant, Stephen knew. His life would never be the same again. Stephen stood there, frozen. The room felt like it was closing in on him. Tara's words echoed in his mind, but they didn't make sense. His brain refused to process the truth. She had confessed, she had admitted to everything, and yet all he could do was stand there in shock. 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind, each one more painful than the last. He could hear her sobbing softly, but it only made the silence more deafening. Tara, the woman he had given his life to, had been planning to leave him all along. Not just for a few days, not just for a quick affair, but for an entire future with another man. His world, his family, everything he had worked for, destroyed in an instant. "How could you?" The words escaped him before he could stop them. His voice was low, shaking with fury and disbelief. "How could you do this to me, to us?" Tara's face twisted in sorrow. "I never meant to hurt you, Stephen, but I—" "Don't," he cut her off, his voice rising in anger. "Don't tell me you didn't mean to hurt me. You've been lying to me for months. I've given you everything, and this is how you repay me?" His hands clenched into fists, but he could barely feel them. His body was numb, overwhelmed by the force of his emotions. His heart was a battleground, torn between the love he still felt for Tara and the searing betrayal that had taken root in his soul. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to make her feel the pain she had caused him, but he couldn't. Instead, he felt something darker growing inside of him, something more dangerous than his anger. Tara took a step forward, her voice trembling. "I never wanted this to happen, Stephen. You were always so focused on work. I was alone. I needed someone to notice me." "That's your excuse?" Stephen spat, his chest tight. "You think that's enough? You think that justifies what you've done?" His breathing was rapid now, each inhale feeling like it was tearing him apart. He couldn't see straight. He couldn't think straight. His vision blurred with unshed tears, but there was no relief. There was only the overwhelming desire to make it stop, to make it all go away. Tara's face crumbled, the guilt written all over her features. "I'm sorry," she whispered, stepping closer. "I never wanted to hurt you this much." The sight of her remorse only stoked the fire inside him. The words she said, empty, hollow words, had no meaning anymore. The truth was clear, and the weight of it crushed him from every side. She had never loved him enough to fight for their marriage. She had never been the person he thought she was. In a split second, everything changed. The rage he had been holding back erupted, flooding him with a strength he didn't recognize. His hands shot out, gripping her arms tightly, his fingers digging into her skin as he pulled her toward him. "Stop!" she gasped, her breath catching in fear. "Stephen, please!" But he couldn't stop. The anger that had been building inside him, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all poured out in a torrent. He shook her hard, as if by doing so he could force her to feel the weight of what she had done to him. "You think you can just walk away from me?" His voice was raw, the words coming out in a guttural growl. "You think you can just throw away everything we had for him?" Tara's eyes were wide with fear now. "Stephen, please, But before she could finish, he released her with a forceful shove. She stumbled back, her body crashing into the coffee table. For a moment, they both stood there in stunned silence. The only sound, the rapid beat of Stephen's heart. Tara's chest rose and fell rapidly as she struggled to regain her composure. Her face was streaked with tears, but Stephen felt nothing. He didn't care. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the storm inside him, the need to make her understand how deeply she had scarred him. "You think you can just walk out of my life like this?" Stephen whispered, his voice trembling with something darker than anger. "I'll show you. I'll make you regret this." The words hung in the air, thick with a cold certainty that sent a chill through the room. Tara's eyes widened as the fear in her expression deepened, and for the first time she saw something in Stephen that terrified her. The man she had known, the man she had loved, was slipping away, and in his place stood someone she didn't recognize, a man consumed by rage, by betrayal, by the unbearable weight of being deceived. As she took a step back, her breath hitching, Stephen's mind was already spiraling. His thoughts weren't clear, weren't rational. His body moved on its own, driven by the violent storm within him. He could feel the rage building, coiling tighter and tighter, until it felt like there was nothing left to hold him back. He didn't know what he would do next. He didn't know if he could stop. The anger inside him had consumed everything, and in that moment he was no longer in control. The moment Tara's body hit the floor, Stephen froze. His mind raced, but his body moved on instinct. There was no time to process what had just happened, no time for regret. He had crossed a line, one that could never be undone. Tara lay there, motionless, her face still etched with the fear that had been building for days. For a few long moments, Stephen just stared at her, unable to tear his eyes away. The woman he had loved, the woman who had betrayed him so deeply, was now gone. But there was no time for mourning. He needed to act quickly. If he didn't, everything would fall apart. He moved with mechanical precision, his mind numb with a cold clarity. First, he checked the front door, locked. Then he grabbed the plastic tarp he had hidden in the closet. His thoughts were fragmented, but his movements were deliberate. He had to clean up the mess. He had to hide the truth. With shaking hands, Stephen carefully lifted Tara's body and placed it on the tarp. He couldn't think about what he was doing. He couldn't let himself feel the weight of it. All that mattered now was covering his tracks. The world couldn't know what he had done, not yet. He moved quickly, his mind racing with each step. He dragged the tarp through the house, past the pictures of their happy family, past the reminders of a life that no longer existed. There was no more time for pretending. The house, their marriage, everything was a lie now. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and ragged as he worked. The anger, the betrayal, the overwhelming wave of emotions were still there, but they were buried beneath the cold reality of the situation. He had to cover his tracks. The garage was dark, the air thick with the scent of oil and dust. Stephen took a deep breath as he laid the tarp down on the cold concrete floor. He didn't want to think about the details, how much blood there was, the final moments of Tara's life. He just needed to hide her, hide everything. His hands were trembling, but he couldn't stop. He had made his choice, and now he had to face the consequences. But not yet. Not until he could erase all evidence of what he had done. He took a moment to steady himself. The garage was empty, save for the tools he had stored there over the years. A part of him wanted to sit down, to let the weight of it all sink in, but he couldn't. He had to keep moving. With a quick glance back at the house, Stephen grabbed the cleaning supplies, bleach, paper towels, a bucket, and set to work. He cleaned the blood off the floor, each scrub of the cloth against the concrete sending a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. His mind was a blur of thoughts, memories of Tara, of their life together, but they were pushed aside. He couldn't afford to feel anything now. As he worked, Stephen's thoughts turned to the story he would have to tell. Tara had run away. That was the plan. She had been unhappy, wanted to leave him for James. That's what he would say to anyone who asked. He had to convince them all that everything was normal, that he was still the same Stephen Grant they had all known. The more he cleaned, the more the lie took shape in his mind. He would tell them she was gone. He would tell them she had made her choice. He had to make it believable. No one could ever know the truth. But as the garage began to look more like it had before, Stephen realized something else. This wasn't just about hiding the body. This was about hiding the truth. The truth that Tara had been right about one thing. Their marriage had been a lie. And now, Stephen was the one who had to live with that lie. No matter what he told anyone else, no matter how many times he repeated the story he had made up in his head, he would never escape the truth. But for now, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the next few hours. What mattered was making sure no one could ever find out. The garage, now silent and eerily calm, was his hiding place. It was here, with Tara's body concealed under the tarp and the blood scrubbed away, that Stephen would make his final preparations. His mind was foggy, but there was clarity in one thing. He had to act fast. The sound of the front door creaking open broke the silence, and Stephen froze. His heart skipped a beat, and for the first time that night, he felt the icy grip of panic tighten around him. The air in the house was thick with unease as the police arrived. Stephen stood at the window, his eyes scanning the street below, every sound amplified in his ears. The neighbors had begun to whisper. He had noticed them earlier, standing by their windows looking toward his house. They knew something was wrong, and now the authorities were involved. His mind was clouded with the aftermath of his actions. He had spent hours meticulously covering his tracks, wiping away every trace of the crime. He had lied to himself, convinced himself that he was in control, that no one would find out. But now the sound of police sirens cutting through the still night reminded him that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. He walked toward the door as it creaked open, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. He had known this day would come, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The police had come for Tara, and now they were coming for him. The door opened fully and 2 officers entered. The first, a woman, gave him a sharp, professional glance. The other, a man, looked around the room before focusing his attention on Stephen. "Mr. Grant," the woman said, her tone calm but firm, "we need to speak with you about your wife's disappearance." Stephen's breath caught in his throat. He had told the story, the one he had rehearsed, the one that painted Tara as the one who had left him, that she had walked away in the middle of the night without a word. He had spun the tale with conviction, but the look in the officer's eyes made him feel like a fraud. "I already told the detectives," Stephen replied, his voice betraying no sign of the fear that twisted his gut. "She left me. She's gone." The man officer glanced at the woman, then turned his focus back to Stephen. "We've received several reports from your neighbors about disturbances in your home. They mentioned hearing loud arguing. Can you explain that, Mr. Grant?" Stephen's pulse quickened. He had thought he'd covered his tracks. But the neighbor, the one who had seen him and Tara arguing earlier, had they called the police? "We had a disagreement," Stephen said, the lie slipping easily from his lips. "It was nothing serious. She was upset, and I was frustrated, but that's all it was." The female officer nodded, though there was something in her eyes that made Stephen feel like she wasn't entirely buying it. She shifted slightly, her posture stiffening. "And you've seen your wife since then?" "No," Stephen replied quickly. "She left, and I haven't heard from her since." There was an awkward silence as the officers exchanged glances. Then the woman spoke again, her tone more insistent. "Mr. Grant, we'd like to search your home. We need to make sure everything is in order." The words hit Stephen like a punch to the gut. Panic surged in him, and for a moment he almost lost control. What if they found something? What if they found the bloodstains in the garage? Or the tarp he had used to hide Tara's body? His mind spun, trying to come up with an excuse, a way out, but the police were already moving through the house. Stephen's heart raced as they opened the door to the garage. He could hear their voices from the other side, his body tensed, every muscle screaming for him to act, to stop them before they found the evidence that would bury him. But he knew there was no stopping them. They had already begun their search. The house felt like a cage, and Stephen was trapped inside it. He could hear the officers' footsteps echoing through the garage, each step bringing them closer to the truth he had been desperately trying to conceal. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind raced. He had to act, and fast. Suddenly, the female officer appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. "We found something in the garage. Blood." Stephen's face drained of color. His stomach twisted in a sickening knot. "What?" he managed to say, his voice shaking. The officer didn't respond immediately, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "It's not much," she said, her gaze piercing. "But it's enough to raise some questions." Stephen felt his legs weaken. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for a moment he thought he might collapse. This was it. This was the moment everything would fall apart. "We need you to come with us," the officer said, stepping closer. "We'll have to take you in for questioning." As the reality of the situation sank in, Stephen's mind went numb. There was no more pretending, no more hiding the truth. The weight of what he had done, what he had tried so hard to bury, was now catching up with him. The officers led him out of the house, and as he stepped into the cold night air, a wave of guilt washed over him. He had spent so much time trying to protect himself, trying to keep his perfect world intact, but now it was all crumbling. Tara was gone, and there was no escaping the mess he had made. The interrogation room was cold, the walls bare, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing with a low hum. Stephen sat across from two detectives, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his fingers white from the pressure. He hadn't spoken much since they had brought him in. What was there to say? His heart raced in his chest, the weight of the evidence against him pressing down like a vice. He had spent the night trying to convince himself that somehow everything would be okay. Maybe the blood found in the garage wasn't enough to prove anything. Maybe they wouldn't find the rest of the evidence, the tarp, the tools he had used. Maybe they wouldn't look closely enough to see the truth. But deep down, he knew the truth was already out. There was no hiding it anymore. Detective Jacobs, the older of the two, leaned forward, his voice steady but carrying a sharp edge. "We've found enough to charge you with the murder of your wife, Stephen. The blood in the garage matches Tara's. We know what happened." Stephen swallowed hard, but he didn't speak. His mind was blank, unable to grasp the full gravity of what was unfolding. He had imagined this moment in his head 100 times, each scenario a different variation of the same nightmare, but now that it was real, it was almost impossible to comprehend. "You don't have to say anything," Detective Jacobs continued. "But you should know that it would be in your best interest to cooperate with us. The more you tell us, the more likely it is that we can work out a deal for you." Stephen's throat tightened, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. His thoughts were jumbled. He was a man who had spent his life controlling every aspect of his existence, from his career to his family, but now he was powerless. The decisions he had made had brought him here, and there was no undoing them. Then a voice in the back of his mind pushed him forward. He had to do it. He had to say it. For Tara, for the family that was destroyed because of his actions. "I did it," Stephen said, his voice barely above a whisper. Detective Jacobs didn't react immediately, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room stretched on, making the confession feel even heavier. "I killed her," Stephen repeated, his voice trembling now. "I didn't mean to, but I did." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. The weight of what he had just said hit him with full force. His chest tightened and his hands shook. There was no going back now. Detective Jacobs leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Stephen's face. "What happened, Stephen?" he asked, his tone softer now, almost coaxing. "Why did you do it?" Stephen closed his eyes, the image of Tara's face before the blow, the panic that had flooded his mind, the rage that had consumed him. It all came rushing back. He could see her standing there, her eyes wide with fear, her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself. And in that moment, all he had felt was betrayal, raw and overwhelming. It was as though his entire world had collapsed in on itself. "I couldn't take it," Stephen confessed, his voice breaking. "The lies, the betrayal. She was leaving me. She was going to leave everything behind for him. And I couldn't let that happen. I lost control. I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt her." Tears welled up in Stephen's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, not wanting to show any more weakness. "I just wanted her to stay. I wanted her to choose me. I never thought it would end like this." The room fell silent again, the weight of Stephen's confession sinking in. Detective Jacobs didn't speak, but the silence seemed to fill the space between them. "You understand that this won't be easy for you, right?" the detective asked after a long pause, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "You'll be facing serious charges, but you've taken the first step by being honest with us." Stephen nodded numbly, his mind spinning. What had he done? How had he allowed everything to spiral out of control so completely? The person he was, the man who had always been in control, was gone. In his place was someone who had destroyed his own life, someone who had shattered the very family he had worked so hard to build. "I never meant for her to die," Stephen whispered almost to himself, "but I couldn't let her go. Not like that." The detective nodded slowly, taking in Stephen's words. "I know this is hard, Stephen, but you need to understand that what happened, it can't be undone. Tara is gone, and you're going to have to face the consequences of your actions." Stephen's heart shattered all over again. Tara was gone, and no amount of words, no amount of regret would ever bring her back. He had lost her, and in the process he had lost everything. The courtroom was filled with the quiet hum of anticipation. The air was thick with tension as Stephen sat at the defendant's table, his eyes fixed on the wooden surface before him. His hands, still trembling slightly, rested in his lap, the weight of his actions hanging over him like a heavy shroud. Tara's family sat across the room, their eyes filled with sorrow and judgment, and Stephen couldn't bring himself to look at them. He had taken everything from them. Everything. His defense attorney, a stern woman named Claire, had advised him to stay calm, to avoid showing any emotion. But how could he? How could he not feel the crushing weight of guilt when the evidence against him was undeniable? His confession, the bloodstains in the garage. It was all there, laid out before the court. The truth was inescapable. The prosecutor, a man named Robert Grant, no relation to Stephen, stood up, his voice strong as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have presented clear and irrefutable evidence that Stephen Grant killed his wife, Tara Grant, in cold blood. There is no doubt that his actions were premeditated. He knew what he was doing, and he did it anyway. The text messages, the blood, the body hidden in the garage, all of it points to one horrifying conclusion. Stephen Grant murdered his wife." Stephen's breath caught in his throat. The prosecutor's words hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't deny it, couldn't argue with the facts. He had done it. The rage, the betrayal, the overwhelming sense of loss, it had all led him to this moment. And now he was paying the price. Claire leaned in, her voice low but firm. "Remember, Stephen, you have a chance. You need to show remorse. The jury needs to see that you're sorry for what you've done." Stephen nodded, but the words felt hollow. How could he ever make up for what he had done? How could he apologize for tearing apart the life he had built with Tara, for destroying the family he had vowed to protect? As the prosecutor continued, Stephen felt his mind drifting. He tried to focus on the details, on the words, but they all seemed to blur together. It wasn't the evidence that haunted him. It was the image of Tara's face, the terror in her eyes as he had pulled her toward him, the regret that had washed over him too late. If he could go back, if he could change one thing, it would be that moment. But it was too late for that now. He was trapped in the consequences of his own actions. The defense's turn came, and Claire stood up to speak. Her voice was calm, measured, as she began to outline Stephen's troubled past. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you're hearing is the result of years of emotional distress. Stephen Grant did not wake up that morning with the intention to murder his wife. This was a tragic series of events, an unfortunate explosion of emotions. He loved Tara, and when he found out about the affair, he couldn't handle the pain. He made a terrible, irrevocable decision, but this was not a cold-blooded killing. This was the act of a man who had lost everything. Stephen felt a pang of guilt as Claire spoke. He knew what she was doing. She was trying to make him seem like a victim of his emotions, a man who had snapped under the weight of his suffering. But that wasn't the truth. He hadn't just snapped. He had made a choice, and that choice had ended Tara's life. He had known exactly what he was doing in that moment. The trial continued, each day bringing with it more reminders of what he had done. The witnesses, the testimony, the expert opinions. It all painted a picture of a man who had been driven to madness, but who had still made the conscious decision to end a life. He couldn't escape that truth. No matter what his defense team said, he knew what he had done. By the time closing arguments arrived, Stephen was exhausted. He hadn't slept properly in days, the weight of the trial and the guilt eating at him from the inside. Claire spoke once more, urging the jury to show mercy, to understand that Stephen was not a monster, but a man who had been broken by his own emotions. Then it was the prosecutor's turn. Robert Grant's voice was filled with righteous anger as he recounted the details of Tara's final moments. "She didn't deserve this," he said, his eyes sweeping over the jury. "She was a woman who had been betrayed, and in the end, it cost her her life." The final statement hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Stephen felt the full weight of his guilt pressed down on him. There was no escaping it. Tara's family had lost their daughter, and he was responsible. The reality of it all hit him with such force that it took his breath away. The jury filed out to deliberate, and Stephen sat there in silence, his head bowed. No matter what verdict they reached, he knew he had already lost everything. Stephen sat in the cold, sterile prison cell, his eyes staring blankly at the wall. The verdict had been delivered, and his fate was sealed, 50 to 80 years, a lifetime behind bars. There was no escaping it, no amount of pleading, no amount of regret could undo what he had done. He had destroyed everything, his marriage, his family, his freedom. The world outside seemed distant, almost unreal. Tara's face, her voice, haunted him constantly, replaying in his mind like a broken record. He could still hear the way she had begged him for mercy, the desperation in her eyes when he had confronted her. But it was too late for mercy now. She was gone, and all that was left was the silence of the prison and the gnawing ache in his chest. He had lost everything. His children, once the bright light in his life, were now beyond his reach. He would never again tuck them into bed, never again hear their laughter echoing through the house. They were growing up without him, without their father. The thought tore at him, but he knew that he had brought this upon himself. The days in prison stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Stephen spent most of his time in his cell, staring out through the bars, lost in thought. The cold, gray walls that surrounded him now mirrored the emptiness inside him. He had been so sure of himself before, so convinced that he could control everything. But now, everything was slipping away. He had destroyed the only thing that had ever truly mattered, his family. The guilt was unbearable. The words of his defense attorney, Claire, echoed in his mind. The jury needs to see that you're sorry for what you've done. But was he truly sorry? Was he really remorseful? He had taken Tara's life, and no apology could bring her back. No amount of regret could ever fix the damage he had caused. The trial had been a blur. The evidence was undeniable. The texts, the blood, the confession, it had all pointed to one conclusion. And now, sitting in his prison cell, Stephen knew there was no going back. He could never undo the pain he had caused, and the emptiness he felt would haunt him for the rest of his life. But as the days passed, a different realization began to settle in. The weight of the guilt still crushed him, But there was something else, something that had been buried deep inside him all along. The realization that he couldn't change the past, that no matter how much he regretted his actions, no matter how much he wanted to make it right, it was too late. Tara was gone, and all Stephen had left was the wreckage of his choices. He thought about her family, her parents, her siblings. They had lost their daughter, their sister, in the most brutal way imaginable. They had mourned her loss in silence, knowing that Stephen was responsible. He had taken their loved one from them, and there would never be any forgiveness. How could there be? What he had done was unforgivable. His mind turned to his own family, the one he had destroyed. What would his children think of him? How would they view their father, the man who had killed their mother? The thought made him sick to his stomach. He would never get the chance to make things right. He had been too selfish, too consumed by his own pain to see the damage he was causing. The prison guards came and went, their footsteps echoing down the hall, but Stephen hardly noticed them. The world outside seemed distant, like a dream he would never wake from. He had built a life that he thought was perfect, but it had all been an illusion. Tara had seen through it long before he had. She had known that their marriage was broken, but he had refused to see it. He had ignored the signs, convinced himself that everything would work out, but it hadn't. He was left with nothing now. No wife, no children, no future. The walls of his prison cell closed in on him, and the weight of his choices crushed him further. He could feel the years stretching out before him, each one a reminder of the life he had destroyed. In his quieter moments, when the noise of the prison faded and his thoughts became clearer, Stephen found himself wondering if he could ever find redemption, if there was any chance of atoning for the horrors he had caused. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no redemption for him. There was only the long, painful road of living with the consequences of his actions. And as he sat in the dim light of his cell, he finally understood the depth of his regret. He had taken away everything that had ever mattered, and he would have to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. What do you think of Stephen Grant's actions and the tragic outcome of his choices? Was there a moment when you believe things could have turned out differently? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you.